Hey everyone, this is Janani again. I did want to apologize for the streaming troubles that I had yesterday. I think a combination of my internet connection and running multiple softwares and live streaming made my computer just do weird things. But I did want to bring you guys this video. I think Substance Painter is just such a cool software, super versatile, and is an industry standard now, whether it be in AAA games, in film and animation. I just think it's such a cool and useful tool to have under your belt. I also want to say thank you to everyone who tuned in yesterday and to everyone that's watching this video now. Thank you for being patient with me. I really appreciate it. I also hope that everyone is staying safe and staying healthy and enjoying their summer so far. My name is Janani Harry Huron. I'm a grad student at DePaul University, and I'm a recent board member of JDE, a game development organization here at DePaul. Also, big shout out to them for giving me this opportunity to do this workshop for you guys. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. So, what is Substance Painter? I'm sure I've already mentioned. It's a software to texture your 3D assets, to paint in 3D in real time, and just gives you the freedom to create and paint and have fun and just make whatever your heart desires. I use it almost every day and have fallen so much in love with it, and I hope you guys will too. Um, so to begin, I will be showing you guys how to bring your 3D asset into Painter, whether you're working in Maya, Blender, any other modeling software, 3ds Max. I think the process of bringing in an object is relatively similar. It might be done in different ways in each software, but the general idea is the same. So I'm going to go ahead and show you guys how I bring my model from Maya into Substance Painter. So let's get started. So right here, I have a treasure chest. This is just an asset I made for an environment that I was working on. So as you can see, if I click on my object right here, my object is triangulated. Yours will probably be quadrangulated, as you probably have just finished modeling it. But that's fine. We can, whether it's triangulated or quadrangulated, it all works the same when we export. So the first thing you want to make sure is that our pivot is centered. If your pivot is all the way over here, anywhere on the screen, you're going to have some issues navigating and painting in Painter. So we want to have our pivot centered. And usually the easiest way to do that is to just go up here in this bar, this little blue, the first blue icon, usually right under rendering. If you hover over this, it says center pivot. So our pivot, if we hit D, the D key will go into our pivot. You can see center to my object. So I'm holding down Alt left click and rotating, and we can see that my object is rotating on its own axis, on its centered pivot. The next thing we want to make sure is that our UVs are correct. And if we go ahead and open our UV editor here, you can see that I have my UV shells laid out. I don't see any overlapping shells, any shells that are leaking off the sides. Everything is nicely tight and packed into this one square. And that is the setup that we want. We want them to be nice and clean so that when we're painting, we don't have any overlapping shells or anything that could cause textures to go over themselves or anything like that. That's actually a pretty good segue into this next one, where we want to make sure we have a material on this. So if I go ahead and right click and assign new material, you'll see we have these options. Usually it doesn't make it's not the biggest deal as to what material you want to apply. I just usually tend to go right here into Maya and apply a Lambert. Usually a Lambert material has just very basic information. It's matte, it's easy to see your geometry. It's usually a good baseline to work with. Also, if I go ahead and click my object and go over here into Attribute Editor, we can see that it created a Lambert material. And usually good practice is to name this material. So I'm just going to call this treasure chest. And there we go. So the importance of adding a material is when we take this object into Painter, you're going to see that this material translates as a texture set. So basically what that means is all of the UVs of this object as you can see, we're on one square in the UV editor, and this material is applied to all of these UVs. So this material is holding one set of UVs and one material on it that we can paint. You can also have multiple texture sets. So for example, if I right click and go to face, I can select some of these faces. May say these four, or maybe these, for example. Again, right click, assign a new material, and that would automatically give me 2 texture sets to work with. However, having too many texture sets does take a toll on performance, because it makes the engine read this object multiple times to deal with all of those texture sets. I personally am guilty of this, but I will say that it really depends on the type of object that you are working on. Some objects that are bigger, high detailed, might need multiple texture sets in order to have better resolution, meaning that your UV shells will be spread out more. Let me just pull this up. The UV shells will be spread out more, allowing me to paint more information onto each UV shell rather than having shells like these, which are really tiny, which this basically means that this shell is going to have better resolution than this shell. And you can imagine if I have a really large object or a very detailed object, and if I have lots of UV shells, if I have little tiny pieces like this, my textures aren't going to look too great because their resolution is going to get blurred out. So this is the situation where you might need multiple texture sets. But like I said, I would avoid this if you can because it does take a toll on performance. But for this object, we're going to stick with one texture set. And 2 more things we want to make sure before we're ready for export is if we go back to where we deleted the history, we want to go to the button next to it. Forgive me. If we go back to the button that said center pivot, we go to the button next to it, it is delete history. We want to go ahead and click on that. And it basically deletes any history. So any modeling information, any UV mapping information, kind of cleans out your object. And then if we go one more over, we're going to find this button that says freeze transformations. We hit that. It's going to basically freeze our XYZ position in our space and set everything to 0, 0, 0. If you see what I did there is I navigated to my channel box editor with my object selected. All of my translations, rotation, scale are 0. So we have frozen this transformation in space. So now we're ready to export. If we hit our object, file, export selection, we want to make sure that this is an FBX export. Painter does take object files, but FBX exports just make sure that the model comes in as clean as possible, that it has all of its UV information attached to it, and anything else you may have done, any texture sets will come in without any issues. We also want to make sure if we go open or look into our FBX export settings, we want to make sure under geometry we have smoothing groups set up, tangents and binormals set up, and triangulate. Other than that, if you go down here, all of these tabs are information that will come with this FBX that Painter doesn't really need that. So if you go through here, kind of just toggling through embed media, make sure that you have these checked off so that we're not adding any information that our model doesn't need when we're texturing it. So for example, if this is checked on for you, go ahead and turn that off. Same with lights. If this was checked on, go ahead and check that off. Same with our cameras. We don't need that. Same with animation. We just want to make sure that these settings in geometry are set up correctly. And now we can go ahead and name our object. I'm going to call it SM static mesh underscore treasure chest.fbx. Yes, I do want to replace this. And there we go. Our model has been cleaned up and exported, and we are ready to take it into Substance Painter. Alrighty, so here we are in Substance Painter. For Substance, you can usually get your license just off of Substance by Adobe's website. It's free for students. They usually just ask for your information as well as probably a copy of your ID card to just confirm that you're a student. And once you download it, you will have the entire Substance suite, which is Substance Painter, Substance Alchemist, and Substance Designer. If you haven't heard of them yet or haven't tapped into them, I highly recommend checking them out. Such powerful tools for texturing, and they're used all the time in the industry. But today we're going to be looking at Substance Painter. So what I think I'm going to do is go ahead and import our object here and give you a tour of the UI and how to navigate and what we're working with here. So let's go ahead and go up to the top left here, File, New. And this is where we're going to create our new project, import our object. So under Template, I'm going to go down here and select PBR Metal Rough. So PBR, physically based rendering, and metallic roughness is how the properties of this material is going to be viewed. There's lots of options here, depending on which software you're going to be taking it into, but that can also be adjusted when we are exporting maps, which is the way I prefer to do it. So for now, we're going to go ahead and just select PBR metallic roughness. Right here, we have document resolution. 2048 is usually a good resolution. If you're working on something very high detailed, very complicated, you might want to do 4096, but remember that the file size will also be quite large if you're going to 4096. Another thing that we have here is our normal map format. So normal map is basically the bump detail that we have on our objects. And we have two options here. We have DirectX and OpenGL. So DirectX is usually used in things like Unreal Engine, and many other softwares also respect DirectX. And OpenGL is usually used for Unity. So if you're using Unity, you can select OpenGL, Unreal Engine, and any other maps, you can select DirectX. So let's see, we don't need this turned on. Another feature that's actually specific to my Substance Painter 2020, actually a newer feature, is this thing called Auto Unwrap. And you can actually bring in an object and have it auto unwrap UVs for you. I've not played with this too much myself. I personally prefer to do my UVs in my 3D software where I modeled my object. That way I can make sure that I've adjusted any distortion, making sure that my shells are not overlapping, making sure that I have cuts and seams where I want them, rather than where they're going to be auto unwrapped. So you definitely have more flexibility doing your UVs in your 3D software of choice. But if you want to give it a try and see how it goes, I would recommend that as well. I would love to dive more into auto unwrap and see what it can do. And this last thing called UDIMs, this is going back to what I had mentioned about texture sets. If you have your UVs going off of multiple tiles in your UV editor, then you want to go ahead and click this, create a texture set per UDIM tile, and it will go ahead and create different materials for those different texture sets. So we don't have that right now. We only have one texture set, so we can go ahead and leave this off. We're going to hit select, and let's find our object. So we have our SM treasure chest. Go ahead and hit OK, and then go ahead and hit OK down here. And there we are. Here is our object. So I'm just using the scroll wheel right now. And let's dive into how we're going to navigate. So if you see here, we have two windows. So this is our 3D window, which is our treasure chest. And this is our 2D window, which is our UVs. And what's great about Painter is that you can texture and paint on both or either one. So we have our 3D, so I can go ahead and paint on our 3D view, but then I can also go ahead and paint on our 2D view. So in terms of navigation, it is basically our Maya controls, which is really nice. So if I'm going to hit Alt and left click, I can rotate. Alt middle click allows me to just kind of pan this around, move it here and there, and then Alt right click and drag allows me to zoom, but then I can also use my scroll wheel on my mouse to zoom as well. And the same applies to our 2D view, where I can Alt middle click to move around, Alt right click to zoom back and forth, and then I can hold down, in this case, if I hold down Alt left click, it allows me to rotate my UV sets, which can come in handy depending on how you are painting. Another thing is we can also snap. So for example, if I want to look at the front of this chest while I'm painting, if I go ahead and Control left click, it's going to allow me to do this rotation. However, if I hold down Shift while I'm doing this, so I'm Control left click and Shift, it's going to snap to an axis, an orthographic axis. So if I want to kind of look at it on the left or on the right of the treasure chest, right? Go ahead and rotate and snap. Now I have an orthographic view of the right. Go ahead and rotate, hold down shift, snap. I can see the back. So it really allows us to look at the object on orthographic view as well as move it around the way we please. As you can see, also, there is a light source. And this light source is usually coming from an HDRI, a high dynamic range image. And the way to move this HDRI around, the hotkey is if I hold down shift, and if I hold down my right click and drag like this, it allows me to move my light source around. So if I'm painting on the front, I would like my light source to be here rather than here, so I can actually see what I'm painting. Alrighty, now that we have our object imported into Painter, why don't we go ahead and cover some UI and get familiar with the tools that we have available to us. So just starting at the top, we have our file. If we go into here, we can create a new project, open any previous projects. We have all of our save options here. We can export textures, and we can also export the mesh that we're working with, and also have access to any recent files. If we move over here to edit, which I think edit is actually more important than file, because if we go down here to project configuration, this is where we can fix any mistakes, as I should say, because this is where we can re-import a mesh if we need to, or change any settings that we need to when we first created our project. When is this useful? For example, if I'm painting on my object, on my mesh, texturing it, I have so many layers, I have things going on, and I'm like, oh no, like my UVs are not correct here. Or maybe I have overlapping UVs here. Or maybe even I want to add something to my mesh, take something away from my mesh, but I don't want to retexture it. This is where I can come in and replace my mesh, but still keep the layers preserved. So for example, if I wanted to replace this treasure chest, I could go up to here to select and replace it with a model that I exported again from Maya or your 3D program of choice. I can open it, and now these grayed out options come back. And here I can change my normal map format. Say I pick DirectX from OpenGL by accident, I can change that. And if you've already textured it, something that you want to make sure that you have on is preserve stroke positions on mesh. So that means all the texturing that you've already done will be preserved and transferred over to this new mesh. However, there's a big catch to this, and that is your object should be in the same position in 3D space as the old one. For example, if I had this treasure chest in Maya and I'm making changes to it, I need to make absolutely sure that I do not move it in any way in the X, Y, Z direction. I cannot rotate it or scale it or do anything. The only things I can do are adjust my UVs, add any objects or add any parts of it, remove any parts of it. That I can do without physically moving the mesh. Because what happens is Substance Painter recognizes this object's position and its pivot. So if I move this object and try to re-import it, it is not going to preserve the stroke positions or not preserve the layers. And the textures will be on different parts of it, and in certain cases, they might not even show up. So something that you need to keep in mind is if you need to replace your mesh at any time, make sure that you have not moved it in 3D space, but you can add things and remove things from the model as well as alter any UVs. And that you will do here in the edit project configuration. So it's very powerful, very easy to kind of go back and make any quick fixes that you may need. But please keep in mind, do not move the mesh because that will cause all of your layers and your textures to break. So that's there too. Up here in Window, which I also think is a very important tool, is sometimes if I'm playing around in Painter, say I grab this and I move it over, sometimes I might get rid of it by accident. Sometimes layers go away and I'm like, oh no, like now my UI is messed up. I don't know what to do. I go back to window and reset my UI. There we go. I'm going to go back to my default UI. All of my tabs, everything is going to be back into place and we should be good to go. It does happen sometimes if you're painting and working kind of quickly. You can lose tabs and panels. So just having this up here in window and be able to reset my UI to what it was is very, very beneficial. Moving right along, let's go ahead and go to this side panel over here, right here on the left. This little tool might seem familiar from applications like Photoshop or GIMP, is we have our paint tool. So paint allows us to, of course, go on our mesh and do our painting. We have an eraser tool. We have here what is called the projection tool. This usually works if, for example, I'm painting on something like this curved surface. The projection tool basically projects a perpendicular plane, to the object so that I can actually paint straight onto it, even if it's a more kind of concave or convex surface, and make sure that the paint is directly perpendicular to where I would want it to be. But I would say the most widely used, at least for me, is this thing called polygon fill. So in Painter, while you can physically paint with a paintbrush, you can also paint and fill UVs. So this is why it's very critical that your UVs are set up correctly, because we have this wonderful tool here called the polygon fill. So if we go over here to the right, we see this thing called our properties for our polygon fill. And just a side note, regardless of what tool you're working with, your properties will always be here on the right hand side, right here. So for example, if I go into my paintbrush, I have my paint properties here in the right. If I go to my eraser tool, I will have my eraser properties here in the right. Same with my projection. If this is a little weird, which it can be to kind of go back and forth, of course, Painter gives you all the freedom to go ahead and move things. So for example, all I did here was went ahead and grab this, drag, and you see how when I'm moving it around, I have options to kind of reconfigure my UI. So if I go ahead and drop this here, I'm going to have my tools and my properties right next to it. So this is personal preference. If you find going back and forth to be kind of redundant, you can go ahead and move things around, which is really nice. And if you find that you don't like it, of course, Windows, reset UI, you're back to where you are, and you can go ahead and reset. So let's go ahead and before we move on, kind of go navigate up here a little bit where we have some more settings. So if I'm on my paintbrush, this right here allows me is our size. So the size of our paintbrush. Of course, we have our flow of our paintbrush. We can also adjust opacity up here. Spacing. Depending on the brush, the effects can be very different. If we move on over here, if you see this little double triangle going on, if I hover over it, it's called symmetry. So if your objects pivot, which is coming back to that, why this is so important that your pivot and your transforms and everything are correct, is that we can paint with symmetry, which is very, very useful if you are doing an object that needs to be symmetrical and the same on both sides. It can save you a lot of work just making wonderful paint creations on one side and having that translate over to the other. But what's also super cool is if we go to the right here and drop this down, so it's basically the two triangles with like a little gear symbol, we can alter our symmetry. So in this case, my symmetry is right across the x-axis, but I can also alter it to be on the y. I can alter it to be on the z-axis. If you can see, this red line has moved around. And then we can also change our symmetry settings. So we can show intersection, not if you don't want to see where that is. You can show a plane. So this kind of really chops your model in half and gives you a better visualization of where your symmetry is. You can also alter we also have something called radial symmetry. If you want to paint in a circle, you can see here, as I hover over this, these dots are showing me where my radial symmetry would be. And of course, we can go ahead and change that. It can be on the X, we can change it on the Y, We can adjust the count. So how many of that do we want, as I just kind of demonstrated there? Something like that. Do we want something like that? We can also alter the angle span, like what kind do we want? So there's a lot of options here when working with symmetry. If you really are going for a specific pattern or want to copy over what you've done, turning on symmetry is incredibly beneficial. And then just go ahead and toggle it back if you want to turn off symmetry. Moving right along here, we have, if we drop this menu down right next to this cube, we have our 3D, 3D only, and 2D only. So as I mentioned in Painter, you can paint 3D or 2D. If you are painting just 3D and say you want a little bit more space, if I go ahead and click 3D only, I will only be restricted to my 3D object. Again, if I want to paint on my UVs, paint 2D only, I can go ahead and click that and get my 2D options to show up. Or if I want to see paint on my UVs, for example, and see how that's panning out on my model, I can have my 3D and 2D settings open. And of course, there are hotkeys up here, which is really nice about Painter, is that it tells you what hotkeys are. So if you hit F1, F2, F3 respectively, we can go ahead and toggle between these three modes. And we also here have our perspective and orthographic views. You can usually kind of toggle between these depending on what works for you the best. I usually like to keep it in perspective and then kind of move things around and hit shift if I want to kind of lock into a specific orthographic view. And the last tab that we have here is our render settings. Basically, Substance Painter uses a rendering engine called iRay, which is where we can get some cinematic looking shots, get some cool angles, and really take our proper 3D asset to the next level. As you can see, there are a bunch of settings here, but when we go to texture our object, I will go into these settings a little bit more in detail, but just wanted to let you guys know that you can access your rendering settings here, this little camera icon, and toggling it back and forth will allow you to go back into the render view versus into your viewport or your workspace right here. Again, right here on the right, we have our texture set list. So remember when we assigned a material to this object in Maya or whichever 3D software you are using, that will appear up here. If you have multiple materials, you will have multiple texture sets. We can go ahead and toggle the texture set back and forth just like this. Additionally, we have this thing called shader. So right now, if we go into our shader settings, we have our shader set to PBR Metal Rough, which is what we imported this object as. Under here, there are many settings, depending on the type of look that you're going for. Like, what are you trying to texture? For example, here we have something that's called clay. So basically our shader will be, our texture is going to end up looking like clay. We have something here, I'm pretty sure, this might be from Substance 2020 called Dota, which is basically the style of the game. I'm sure we have many others here. But right now, we're going to stick with PBR Metal Rough. But something that is also important to note is that if we're using transparency, so if we're making glass, if you're making something that's see-through, you want to make sure that you go into your settings, your main shader settings, that is, and click this little icon that is your shader settings, where I was a second ago, and change this to PBR Metal Rough with alpha blending. So essentially, this will allow you to have opacity and have objects be see-through. So that's something important to note here. And there are also, I think Substance 2020 has added in some new shader options, which I think are very worth playing with and getting into. Right here, you can also access your display settings, which are the settings that I just showed you back in the renderer when we went into the rendering settings. So you can access those here too. Which of course I will go into rendering, which of course I will go into rendering once we texture this object. But just to give you a reference that those render settings can also be accessed and applied here in your display settings if you want to play with them in your viewport rather than having to toggle through and going into your render settings. And down here, we have our layers. So very similar to Photoshop, Substance Painter works in layers. You're going to be painting in layers, creating everything in layers. And you're going to find all of that information here and have all of your layers set up. Just going through this real quick. We have all of our channels that you can mess with here. We have a lot of settings that I will go much deeper into this when we start texturing, and I think seeing these in action will really make a difference. But we have all of our layer options here, similar to Photoshop. We have blending modes, we have opacity, and this is where we can add and delete and create different types of layers, which again, I will go more into depth into when we start our texturing process. And here we have our texture set settings. So basically the settings that we set up at the beginning when we imported our object. We have our object name, we have the size. So this is the resolution that we imported into. We have all of these channels. So since we're doing the PBR metal rough workflow, PBR basically is a physically based renderer, is essentially telling us that our object will have these properties. So it'll have a base color, it will have height, which is basically displacement information. It'll have roughness, like how shiny or not shiny this object is, how metal, so metallic, how metal or not metal the object is, and of course our normal map, which is any bump detailing we want to add. So all of that is located here, and this is where you're going to bake. And that is something that we're going to be covering next. But just a quick preview, baking is essentially making sure you're basically taking these maps that you have and applying them to this object. You're basically saying this object now harbors these properties. This object is now capable of having a base color, a height, a roughness, a metallic, a normal, or whatever properties that you want to add. And we can add more of those properties right here. So if I click the plus sign, we have so many options here. As I mentioned, opacity is right here. We have reflection, scattering. So if you go here and click the plus sign, you can add any of these properties to this object. So you can go ahead, say if I want opacity, I can go ahead and add that in, and now it's added in. And then if I want emission, I can go ahead and add that in. And so now I have all of these properties that this object can now harbor. And in order to do that, I'm going to bake, and basically it's a way of just assigning these properties to this object. So we will get more into that in a little bit in terms of baking workflow and all of that, but just wanted to get you familiar with what we have over here. And again, like I mentioned a little while ago, we have our properties, which a lot of the layers here too also will have their own properties, as will all of your tools. So your paintbrush, your eraser, all of that. You can find properties of the layer, the tool, the material that you're working on can all be found here. And of course, we can move things around. So last, and definitely not the least, in fact, this is the most important part of the UI, I think, is the shelf. Down here is where we're going to have all the goodies to be able to texture with, alter our textures, add to our layers, and just take our texturing game to the next level. So I will go more in depth into these as we start texturing, but I just want to give you an overview of what you can find here and where to navigate to if you're looking for something. So the first thing we have here are alphas. So alphas are essentially all of these shapes that can be used as stamps. You cannot necessarily paint with them like drag, but you can click and they will stamp this image onto your mesh. So the white portion of each alpha is what you will be seeing as a stamp, whereas the black portion will be invisible. So this alphas can also take different properties. They can take height, values, colors, roughness, metallic, mission, basically whatever texture, whatever channels you have in your texture set over here. If I'm looking over here to my right, base color, height, roughness, metallic, you can basically stamp on any of these properties using the alphas. Next in line are grunges. Grunges are kind of like filters. They basically are different types of noise that can add some variation to your channel. So if you add in a grunge to your metallic map, for example, there are going to be areas where the metallicness will be in the pattern of this grunge. So it's rather than the whole thing being metallic, you'll just have metallic in these areas, either the white areas or the black areas, depending on how you apply the grunge. You can also paint with the grunge to get like really cool patterns and things like that. So a grunge is something that could be added to your brush or can be used to alter material directly. Um, Procedurals down here are similar to grunges in that they're just a bunch of patterns that you can add onto your brush. You can basically put these in layers to have like different patterns on different parts of your mesh. You can paint with them. And again, they can also take the properties of your texture set settings. This area is your textures, where this part actually represents textures that you are bringing in. So for example, if you were to bring in your own texture, you would usually find the textures that you brought in this area, which in a little bit I will go over how to properly bring in your own textures. So we will definitely cover that. Moving right along, we have hard surfaces. These are similar to alphas, but these are normal map stamps. They basically have a variety of shapes here, and they function very similar to alphas, where you can just stamp on these shapes. The only difference is that these are normal map stamps, so all of this information will be logged into the normal channel, whereas any information from your alphas will be logged into your height channel. So we will go over this workflow of exporting textures as well as making sure that your channels are accounted for. But the only difference is that these hard surfaces will be logged into your normal map channel, and the alphas will be logged into your height channel as they are displacement. Skin, this basically has a variety of materials for skin. The way that a lot of these material balls work is that if you just kind of drag and drop them into your layers, your object will take that value. So this part of it, this section itself is just all skin. And if I kind of toggle over, you can see that there's skin for different types of the body, different tones, there's different textures. So if you're ever doing maybe some sort of creature, some sort of a human character, might be nice to come in here. Ooh, they even have zombie bubbles. Huh, interesting. But it might be nice to come in and play here, bring these in and play with them here. We have filters here. This I will cover more in depth as well, but similar to grunges and procedurals, a filter is something that can also alter how your texture is looking. You basically would apply this to one of your layers and it would take this value. For example, if I had a color layer and I added a filter like this, it could take this it would take this property to have like perforated circles and matte finish hammered. So you can really customize and get a variety of effects by using filters attached to your layers. And of course, don't worry, I will be going over how to use all of these when we start texturing this object. Our brushes, I think this is really cool, where like when you are painting, for example, if you go to the top left and select paint, just like this, you can go in here and select what kind of brush you want to paint with. So currently, I believe I'm using basic hard. I think that's what it defaults to, but I can go ahead and pick dots and paint with dots, or I can pick dirt splash and paint with that. So this really gives you some a lot of leeway and a lot of variety in different ways that you can paint. I mean, look at all these brushes, which is really great. Something that's also super awesome is that you can paint with particles. So there's a few of them here, which are kind of fun to play with. But the way, see that broken glass. But for these particles, basically just kind of clicking and dragging makes this effect kind of happen. So right now I'm painting with broken glass, for example. And this of course can also take the properties of your texture set channels. So your color, height, roughness, metallic, etc. You can really customize and make awesome things with these, and really play with different effects and getting really cool things happening on your model. Tools here, this is kind of similar to the particles, where these tools are actually little brushes of themselves. So for example, if I go ahead and kind of toggle over this one, so screw bolt is something that I like to use quite often, is kind of just clicking. So if you see that, I have a screw, which is really, really nice. So it's basically another type of paintbrush that I can go ahead and paint with. Moving right along, we have our materials. So our materials and our smart materials here. What's really cool about this is that these are pre-made materials by people who have either submitted materials to Substance or materials that Adobe already provides for us. But these are things that you can use for anything. Very similar to the skin. If I want something to be brass or gold, I can go ahead and drop it into my layers and I'll have this going on my model. So these materials are very customizable as well. As I mentioned, if you go down to their properties, which I will go in more depth later, you can really go in here and adjust properties and play with these materials. So they're really nice to have to give you a baseline to start with and kind of give you an idea of what you're going for. Same with smart materials. These ones are a little bit more, have a little bit more information to them compared to the materials, but also very versatile, very customizable. Moving right along, we have these smart masks. So a smart mask is very similar to a grunge, for example, whereas the areas that are white and more gray are the areas where the effect will happen, whereas the areas that are blacked out are the areas that are masked out. So those areas will not have a specific color or texture. So smart masks are something that you can just add on to a layer, for example, and that layer that has your color or some sort of material on it will only be visible in the areas of the mask that are white as opposed to the areas that are black, which means that it is removing the material from those areas. And I will definitely show you all of these things in action as well. Moving right along into environments, as I mentioned, if you hold down Shift and right click, we can move our light source. Our light source, like I mentioned, is coming from an HDRI, which is a high dynamic range image. And this is where you can customize it. We can go ahead and choose a variety of environments. If you see here, there's something called Cave Entry, Corsica Beach, Glazed Patio. All of these have different colors, so you'll basically get different tints. If I go into Cave Entry, for example, I might get a greenish tint to my light, whereas if I go into Canopus Ground, I may get more of an orangish tint to my light. Where these ones over here are more of like a studio setup, so it's more of like a white light. So depending on how you want your object to look, you can go ahead and play with these a variety of environments and see what's making your materials look the best. Additionally, like I said, you can also add in your own environments and either something that you created or something that you imported from online, which, by the way, if you are looking for environments and textures, I highly recommend HDRI Haven, which has a variety of very good resolution HDRI images as well as textures. And if you haven't already, check out textures.com so you can use seamless textures and bring those in to apply to your models. So I know what you guys are probably thinking right now. You're probably like, Janani, this is great, but I want to start painting. I want to start texturing this object. Well, let's get started. So I'm going to just walk you through just a few housekeeping things we need to take care of before we can really get into the fun part. And this is the baking workflow. As I mentioned before, if we go over here to our texture sets, we have these channels. And these channels are our PBR properties, which are base color, height, roughness information, metallic information, normal map. I just added in opacity just to show you guys, but this treasure chest does not need anything see-through, so I'm going to go ahead and take that off. I don't think I want anything emissive as well, but I'll just go ahead and leave that there so I can maybe show you guys an example with emission. But now that we have these properties set up, they're still not applied to our object. So we know that we want these properties, but we want to tell Painter, hey, I want to be able to use these properties, so please apply them to my object so that I can now have this object inherit these channels so that I can paint on them and create maps from these channels. So that process is called baking. So when we bake, we're basically attaching all of these channels onto this object so that we can input information into these channels for texturing. So once you set up your resolution and you have all the channels you want, we want to go ahead and click Bake Mesh Map. Real quick, something to keep in mind, going back off of what I was saying of they are not currently connected, is if you go down here to Mesh Map, under Bake Mesh Maps, you can see that it says select normal map, select world space normal. So these are the mesh maps that will be generated from this information of the channels. And if you can see currently, it's asking us to select these maps, which means that they are not currently there. This is telling you that all these channels have not yet been baked onto this object. And so this object, as a result, currently does not have any information for what could potentially be thickness, or what could be curvature, or what could be its normal map. So we need to bake. So let's go ahead and hit Bake Mesh Maps, and we have this option. So if we go over here, we can see all of these maps that this object is going to bake. It's going to create this information so that we can now use our channels to add all of our texture information into them. So we want normal, we want world space normal. We don't want ID. ID is essentially a way that certain softwares interpret like vertex painting and other types of painting. So for now, for something simple, we don't want to enable ID. Ambient occlusion is also optional. Ambient occlusion is something that you can add in later. I just like to leave it, and if I see that it's breaking my model or it's creating occlusion in areas that I don't want it, I can just remove it later. Curvature, position, and thickness. We want all of those as well. Under output size, we want to go ahead and make it the resolution that we imported our object as. So that's 2048. Something that's important here is this low poly to high poly mesh. So one of the greatest thing about Substance Painter is that high to low poly baking is possible. What that means is that if I have another version of this treasure chest that is super, like the curves are super smooth, the edges are super sharp, and there's a lot of detail, it's going to be very high poly. I want to be able to bake that high poly information onto this low poly model. So if I take it into a game, I can have the low poly model, but have a normal map of the high poly. In this case, you would be able to load in a high poly model here by clicking this button and bake those normals onto the low poly. However, in this case, we are working with a low poly treasure chest, so we'll go ahead and use low poly mesh as high poly mesh. You're basically saying that this is the mesh that I'm using, bake it onto itself. We don't have a high poly that we want to bake from. And all of these settings down here have to do with that high to low poly baking process, which we're currently not doing, so we don't have to worry about that. You can go ahead and leave diffusion. It doesn't really change much when it comes to how your model is going to be baked. So why don't we go ahead and bake these mesh maps? It'll take a second. Now we can see, if we navigate to our texture set, we have information. We have a normal map that we can start adding things to. We have world space normals. We have ambient occlusion. We have curvature that it picked up from our model. So when we start texturing, we can use this information to amplify all of our maps that we have here. So in order to see these maps, if I hit C on my keyboard, I can go ahead and run through the channels. And if you look over here to your right above this 2D UV view, as I keep hitting C, it's telling me what maps that I am looking at. I'm looking at base color, I'm looking at height, this is roughness. Currently, you won't see much of a change because there isn't any information in there yet. But as you start to add information, you're going to see that detailing in all of these maps. This is useful if you are, for example, doing a normal map and you are like, I wonder how deep this normal map is going, or like how much bump information do I have? Sometimes it can be difficult if you have a lot of textures stacked on one another. So sometimes just isolating this channel really helps in giving you a better visual of what you're actually working with. Now to go back to our normal material mode, we go ahead and hit M and we can toggle back. Remember, if we want to see our channels, we hit C, and if we want to go back to our normal material, we're going to hit M on our keyboard. And now that we have baked, we have slots where we can start to add in information. And we are ready to texture. All right, so now the fun can really begin, and we can go in and start texturing our treasure chest. So why don't we go ahead and take a look how we're going to turn this into something like this. So let's get started. So if we go over here to our layers section, we can see that it's kind of similar to Photoshop where we have options such as adding masks, adding a layer, adding a fill layer, creating folders, smart materials, effects. So this is where all of your layers of your textures are going to be stored and where you're going to be adding things, editing your textures, moving things around, and this is where all your information is going to be stored. So let's go ahead and see what is going on here and how to use it. So in terms of texturing, there are two types of layers here in Painter. One here is just says add a layer. So this is called a paint layer. And the one next to it with the little bucket tool is called add a fill layer. So let's go ahead and start with a paint layer and I can walk you through how this works. So if I go ahead and add a paint layer, go ahead and put this up here. And of course, like I just showed, if you want to move layers around, you can just drag and drop them up there or wherever you need them to be. So a paint layer is a layer that you can directly paint on. So let's go over how we're going to do that. So if I go over here to my brush tool for my paint right here, I can literally just go in and start painting on my object just like this. So some hotkeys to use when you start painting is if you hold down Control, left click, and you start moving your mouse up and down, you can see that I can rotate the brush, just like this. If I Control, left click, and hold down my left click and move my mouse from side to side, if you look over here to my right, under Properties, you can see that this is adjusting the flow of the brush. If I Control, right click, and I move my mouse up and down, you can see that it's altering the size of my brush. This is very useful when you're going in and painting really quickly and you don't want to toggle to this tab up here in order to alter your size and your opacity, which can also, of course, be done in Properties, but just having these hotkeys is useful. So again, Control, right click, and move your mouse up and down to change the size. Control, left click, and move it side to side for flow. And Control, left click, and move it up and down to rotate. As you can see, the circle is going around, depending on where I want to rotate my brush. Going back to this wonderful Properties menu right here on the right, you can see that all of our paint properties are here, so everything that I just mentioned. But something that's also there, if we scroll down a little bit, is we see this thing called Material. So under Material, this should look familiar that we have our color, our metal, rough, normal, height. These are our PBR channels. So if we go up here, we can see we have base color, metal, roughness, normal, and height. So these are the properties, if you guys remember, that we baked in to our object at the beginning while we were setting it up to start texturing. So we may have different channels here depending on how many we baked in. And basically what this does is that it allows us to apply these properties to the object. So basically what this means is that we are allowed to paint on these objects with color. We can paint with a metallic material. We can paint with roughness properties. We can paint with a normal map. And we can also paint with height. And if you go down here, if you scroll down just a little bit, you can see that you have options for all of these properties as well. If we toggle base color, we can see here that we can select our color. We have a little option to color pick. We can also move our sliders to pick the color that we want. Under here in metallic, you can see that if we move our slider, we can have our metal be 1, so very metallic, or have our metalness be at 0. And if you kind of look up here, we have a little shader ball that tells you what your material is going to end up looking like. So currently I have my base color set to white. Why don't we move that something to like a nice cherry red? And if I try to bump up my metallic, you can see that it's starting to pick up a lot of reflections and look like something that's very metal. Right here we have our roughness. So this is how glossy or how matte is this material. So if I move it all the way down, you can see that I can see my entire HDRI because it is very reflective. And I can also move my slider up to something that's a little bit more matte. Just like that. And we also here have a normal value. So if I want to, I can bring in a normal map and just throw it in here, which I'll show you how to bring in textures and other things in a moment. And we also have a height value. So you see that the height value does not actually change on the material ball, but when you paint, you'll see that our height of, you can either have a height of 1 or -1, which means that the paint will either be very extruded or will be very intruded. So why don't we just go ahead and put our height down there? Let's go ahead and control, right click and drag and make our brush a little smaller and just start to paint. So you can see right now that my brush opacity, my brush flow, I should say, is actually very low. So I'm going to go ahead and control left click and increase that. Gonna go ahead and just drag my mouse to the right to increase it. And I'm going to start painting again. So see now, there we go. We can actually see something that's a lot more prominent. So if we go ahead and zoom in here, we can see that our material is actually extruded. It actually has some thickness to it coming off of the object because we've set our height to 1. You can see that our color is red as we've set it to. It is very metallic and very shiny as we have set here in the material. So the ability to adjust your properties is very flexible and also gives you a lot of options. What's also great is that you don't have to paint with all of these. If we go ahead in here and say, maybe I don't want this normal map, I can go ahead in my properties and just press that button and it will toggle off my normal map. I can also take off my height, say I don't want to paint with height anymore. If I want to just go back in here and I just want this color and the metallic. So you can see the difference here where we have this one, which is just our paint with our metallic and roughness, where we have this over here, which had our height value. So I can very easily change what I am painting with depending on what I need by just toggling off these channels, which makes it very versatile and very, very nice. Another thing that we can do here, I'm going to go ahead and just add another layer and get rid of this, is that remember the alphas that we spoke about in our shelf? So our alphas are our stamps. And if you remember, we can just stamp this on and they can also harbor all of these properties down here. So right now I have this set to my color, metal, and roughness. And our stamp is also going to have these properties. Something very important to remember is that alphas can only be stamped on in paint layers. They're considered paint. So what we can do is if we go into our alpha shelf, we can pick any of these. I think I'm going to go with something like this, with this atom. I can double click it. And if you see right here, my manipulator has turned into the alpha. Another way of doing this is we can also drag this and drop in our properties panel under where it says alpha. So if I go ahead and drag in another one, you can see that my alpha has changed. I can also go ahead and put this atom back in and you can see that my brush is now this alpha. And my alpha is going to take all of the properties that I have set up here. So if we scroll down, I still have this color, metal, and roughness going on. So the way alphas work is we just click. Look at that. We have a stamp that has all of these properties that I've just set up. If I want to put in my height, go ahead and add something like this. And if we give it a stamp, we can see instantly the difference of what we are working with. We have this, and remember, I'm holding down shift right click to move my light so that I can see exactly what is going on. And I think that looks really cool. Alphas are super useful to add very minute detailing in order to really bring a different character to your models, to your texturing. And remember, alphas are basically just 2D images right here, where the white values are what are going to be shown and the black values are what are going to be masked out, which of course, if we go into our properties in our paint, we can invert that as well. So if we're here under parameters where you see invert is false, if you go ahead and change this to true, it inverts it. So now you can see that my alpha looks a little bit different. So for my atom right now, it's basically going to invert the properties. So the white is going to take the property of the black mask, and the black mask is going to take the property of the white portion. So if I stamp, you can see that we get a very different result. So there's lots of options here where you could play with inverting your mask as well. And what's really great is alphas can be just made in Photoshop or whichever in another editing software of your choice. You just have to bring them in, export them, and bring them in, which is a good segue into how we can start exporting textures and how do we bring those textures that we want to use into Painter. Let's go over that right now. As I mentioned, alphas are very easily created in Photoshop, and your options are really endless with what you can bring in and start making as a stamp. But let's go ahead and see how we're going to import our alphas into our project. If I go ahead and open my documents here, I've made an alpha like this for another project I'm working on. This is just like a tab that you would find at maybe the top of a soda can, maybe the top of a food can. And what I can do is, this is a PNG file, by the way. So what I can do is just drag and drop this into my shelf right here. And it's going to bring up this dialog box. And this dialog box is going to tell me, okay, so I've brought in this PNG called can tab, but it is undefined. So why don't we click that? And now I have some options here to import it as what? An alpha, color, an environment, or a texture. In this case, I'm going to import it as an alpha. So what this tells Painter is that this alpha is able to be drag and dropped in to my paintbrush and used as an alpha. And I'm going to also go down here to where I want to import my resources, drop this down. Do I want it in my current session, my project, or my shelf? I'm going to go ahead and hit project and import it, and we can see that we have it right here. And if I double click it, it is now my paintbrush. And so now what I can do is, let me go ahead and give it a test. So I'm just going to change my color, I think, right here on the right in my properties. I think I'll up my roughness just a tad as well. And if I give it a stamp, there it is. We have our alpha, and it is exhibiting the properties of what we set it up as. So for other textures, for example, if anything that you got off of textures.com, maybe you photoshopped a texture, you can import these in the same way. So if I go ahead and open this, maybe I want to grab this texture that I've made right here. If I want to go ahead and drag and drop that in, it's going to give me the same dialog box, but under undefined, I want to import it as a texture. So it's going to come in with all of its color information and its texture information, but it will not exhibit the same function as an alpha. So I cannot just go and drop it in as an alpha, but rather use it as a texture. So if I go in to my session, I'm going to go ahead and go to treasure chest. You see how it drops it in to a different part of the shelf because it is no longer an alpha. And now I can utilize this texture. What's really nice is I can grab this and drop it into my base color. And so now you see this change. So if I go ahead and remove my alpha, I don't want to paint with my alpha anymore. I want to paint with this texture. So right now you can see that I have no alpha on. But what I can also do to have a little fun is, as I mentioned, we have brush options. So if I go in here, maybe you want to pick some sort of brush option and go in here and just kind of start painting. So you can see that it is using this texture as my color for my brush. Now that looks a tad bit scary. And if we actually want this texture to show up this way, we actually want to apply this in a different way. And this comes to something that I think is very, very cool called a stencil. So a stencil is basically a way of using this texture as a template and being able to paint over it to get this result. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make sure that my alpha is cleared up. I'm going to remove this from my base color because I don't actually want to paint with that. I want the texture to show up. And I'm going to go over here to the left and go into projection mode. So projection mode is really great because I'm able to paint directly onto the surface in basically perpendicular to the surface. So what I want to do here in projection mode is I want to go to my properties right here. So these are my same paint properties that I had listed. what I want to go ahead and do is go into, let's go over here, and we can go ahead and drop, sorry, that's the wrong one. Go ahead and find that texture that we had. So if I go ahead and grab this, I can put this in as my base color. And now you can see that that texture has been dropped in as the projection. And there are many ways to alter this as well. So the hotkeys for projection is if you hold down S, and if you hold down right click, you can go ahead and move it and make it bigger or smaller. If you don't hold down S on your keyboard and left click, you can rotate like this. And very similar to how we move an object, if we hold down shift, we can snap our stencil, our projected texture, to any axis. So maybe I want to keep it like something like this, just like that. And so now all we need to do is pick our brush. So in this case, why don't I go back over here? Make sure you are still in projection mode and not in your brush mode. So let me just go back here. So I have my brush already set up for me. That was my bad. But I can go ahead and see if I want to change my brush. You want to do that down here. So if I want to pick this brush, for example, I think that'll be kind of cool. And then I can just start painting. And look at that. It is painting my texture, but it's also painting with the properties of the brush that I'm using. If I want more of like, say, a grunge effect, or maybe I don't want to paint the whole texture because I'm making like something that's worn down, I can make that happen with the type of brush. And as always, we can go down here and adjust our properties. So we have our color. Do I want it to paint with something more metallic? Do I want to paint with something more rough? You have all the options as you did with a regular paint layer or a regular alpha available to you when painting in projection mode as well. All right, so now that we've covered paint layers, let's go ahead and cover fill layers. So I'm going to navigate over here to the right, and I'm going to click on this little paint button icon that says add a fill layer. We're going to go ahead and add that in. And a fill layer is basically an unpaintable layer. Fill layers are used for basically filling large amounts of space with a similar material or texture. So if I go to my fill layer over here and I look at my properties, you can see I have very similar properties to my paint layer. Color, metallic, roughness, basically all of the channels we have inputted into this object. But if I go over here to my base color and start to mess with it, maybe I want something red, you can see that it changes the material of my entire object. So this fill layer has basically filled this entire material and its UVs with this specific color. I can also go ahead and adjust my metallic slider. Maybe I want something a little bit more like this. Can play with my roughness. So I can really go ahead and adjust these properties on the fly, and it will apply these changes to the object immediately. Another way to fill your object is by using materials and smart materials, which also function as fill layers. So for example, if I want to use this brass pure material, I can go ahead and just drag it and drop it right above my fill layer. And you can see that because it is on top of another fill layer, it goes ahead and overrides the previous fill layer. And if you scroll down here to the properties, you can see that our material has been given a certain amount of properties to have this certain look. So it has a specific color, it has a specific metallic value, and a specific roughness value to get this material of brass pure. But this can also be altered. Say I want something a little bit more shiny, I can drop my roughness. If I want something maybe a little bit more matte, I can drop my metallic. So you can see that even with the smart materials and materials that are given to you, you have a lot of flexibility in how you want your materials to look. This is really nice because once you have an idea of how you want to texture the object, you can use smart materials and regular materials as a baseline to create your textures, and then modify them as you wish to get the look that you're going for, making this process a little bit more quick rather than having to make every single material by yourself. But what if we don't want our entire object to be covered with this material? So for a paint layer, remember, we were able to specifically target certain areas of the object that we wanted to paint on. However, a fill layer just fills the entire object with this material, and it also overrides the previous fill layer when with the one that is on top. This is where we have the concept of masking. And for everyone that uses Photoshop, it's very similar to this, where we can just add in a black mask or a white mask in order to specifically target the areas that we want to fill. So if I go ahead into my brush Pure, and if I right click, I see I have a drop down menu here. I'm going to navigate to the top where I can see all of these mask options. And you can also find these mask options at the top of this toolbar right here, right under texture set settings, where it says add mask. Feel free to use whichever method is more comfortable for you. But I'm going to go ahead and right click and select add black mask. And I'm also going to go ahead and toggle off this layer so we can see what we're doing a little bit more clearly. So you can see when I added the black mask, my gold material disappeared. So now this is what it's telling me now is that this entire material has been masked out. So now we want to go in and add to this mask and tell it, okay, I want these specific areas to be this gold color. And there are two ways to do that. So I know I mentioned that fill layers are unpaintable, but when they have a mask on them, we can actually paint in the mask to add information from the fill layer. So for example, I have this mask selected right now. Make sure that you have your mask selected. And I have my brush selected on my left side. And I can go ahead and paint. And if you can see here, I'm adding information into this black mask by painting in the areas that I want this gold to show up. Forgive me, it's kind of bleeding over the edge. But I basically am able to paint into the areas that I want the fill layer to exist because of this mask that I have. Just like that. But another way that is more efficient is if I go ahead and right click on the mask, I can clear the mask, so it's going to remove all of my information, is by doing a polygon fill. So this is why having good UVs is very important, because we can specifically select certain UVs and certain parts of the object to do a mask fill. So if I go over here to the left, we have this icon called polygon fill. And if I click that, it's going to give me some properties. So if we kind of go over this, we kind of hover over this first one. This is called UV chunk fill. So if I select that, it's basically going to select a whole UV chunk when I click on it. So for example, if I want this part of the treasure chest to be selected, I'm going to click UV chunk fill. One other thing to make sure is your color. So for example, if I have a black mask, I would want my color to be white, because when I'm inputting white information, that's telling the mask that I want the fill layer to show on the areas that I have marked as white. If I don't want the mask to show, I would go ahead and move this to black and tell the mask that I want to remove this area. So for example, if I move this to white and click right here, it's going to add this information to my mask right there. However, if I realize that I do not want this information there anymore, I can go ahead and move this all the way to black, click on this UV chunk again, and it removes it. The same applies to the rest of these fill modes. So we have UV chunk fill, which will fill basically the whole shell of your UV. We have something next to here called mesh fill. We go ahead and click on that. You can see that it's selecting actually the whole mesh and different parts of the mesh. So in this case, I have 4 pieces to my mesh. I have the top, the 2 handles, and the bottom. So if I select the bottom, it's going to select the whole mesh. And if I want to go over here to the next one, we have something called polygon fill. So this is going to select individual polygons. If you can see here, I can very, very easily target where I want this material to be. And the one next to it is triangle fill. If I hover over this, and I can go in and select very, very specific triangles. So if your mesh is already triangulated, your polygon fill and your triangle fill will kind of function the same. However, if you have a mesh that you did not triangulate and you just have quads in here, having your polygon fill will be very useful. So it can go ahead and select individual polygons for you to fill. Something that is also super cool about fill layers is that we can add effects to them. So, for example, if we want any dirt, any type of grunge, any type of different type of surface texturing, this is something you can achieve by adding a generator or a filter. So let me go ahead and create another fill layer here. Go ahead and delete this. I'm going to go ahead and clear my mask and remove it as well. So let's just go ahead and start with this gold chest. So for example, say I want to add some sort of dirt or some sort of kind of height detailing just to give this a little bit more grain, a little bit of detail. So like I mentioned, I can use a generator for this. And generators can only be applied to masks of a fill layer, as generators are usually an overlay, and we usually only want the generator to be applied to little parts or certain parts of the object. So the way I'm going to approach this is I'm going to go ahead and have this fill layer that has my brass pure, and then I'm going to add another fill layer on top. And under here, let me go ahead and pick a color for my dirt. So maybe I want something, let's see, maybe like a dark brown might be something I could start with. So let me go ahead in here. Maybe you want something kind of like this. Alrighty. And then I'm going to go and add a black mask to that. And I'm going to right click on this mask. And if I scroll down, I'm going to see this option here called Add Generator. I'm going to go ahead and click that. And right here, we're going to get an option saying generator, no generator selected. So I'm going to go ahead and click on this so I can select a generator. And down here, we can see we have all these options for generators. So I'm able to create linear gradients. I can add in some ambient occlusion. I have different options like this, for example, dripping rust, fiberglass edge wear. We have dirt. We have lots of cool things that we can do with this generator. But for this purpose, I'm going to go ahead and add a dirt generator. So as you can see immediately, we have this dirt being applied to our mesh. And that is actually looking really cool. So something that I can also do is if I go over here to these properties, you can see that my generator has a lot of options that I can play with here. So for example, if I want to play with the dirt level, I can go ahead and play with this slider. Maybe that might be a little overkill, but maybe I want something just kind of slightly, just maybe something like this, have a little bit of that. I can play with contrast of my dirt. I can play with some blending contrast, the amount of grunge, if I want something super extreme or something a little bit more subtle. I can also play with this edge masking and all of those things. Something that's super important to remember with generators, and this leads to why it is so important that we are baking our maps, is if we go down here, we can see our image inputs. So we have the maps that we have baked out. Our curvature, our world space normal, our position. You can see here I have an X on ambient occlusion. And this is basically saying that I have not baked out my ambient occlusion. In certain cases, this is all right, depending on what you are creating and what you are using. But for generators in specific, it is very crucial that you have this curvature map. Most generators, the way that the effect applies is dependent on the curvature of the object. For example, if you want them to be in these like little nooks and crannies, it is like very important that the generator knows that there's curvature information that it can follow. For this reason, it is very important that you bake out your mesh maps, or the generators are not going to work properly. The other type of effect that we can work with is called filters. So if I go ahead and remove our dirt generator, filters can be applied directly to the fill layer that we are working with. So if I go ahead and right click here as well, I can go ahead and say add a filter. And so I can go ahead over here and click on our filter. And if I scroll down here, I have lots of filter options as well. So for example, if I want to select, let's go ahead and pick this one right here. You can see that I have this very interesting kind of marbled kind of effect going on. So this filter called Matte Finish Galvanize has applied this effect directly onto my model. So if I want to remove that, I can just go ahead and click the X right next to it, as I just did. And I can go ahead and say add a filter again. And maybe I want to pick something else. So if I go down here, I can pick this one. So this adds something interesting to our model as well. And if I want to remove it, I can go ahead and click the X here. But what if I want this effect to only be on parts of our model? For example, if I go ahead and add another filter, something that's really cool that has been added is this filter called Matte FX Water Droplets, that's a bit extreme, but similar to generators, if we go down into our properties, we can adjust the amount of droplets that we want. We can play with the size, so maybe we want something super tiny, not as intense. We want to maybe play with the scale, the amount. You can also go ahead here and hit random if you want it to just generate a random positioning and random size. But I think this is kind of subtle and looks kind of nice. And as you can see, we can go ahead and just add on the filter to our fill layer to get this effect. But as I was saying, say I don't want these droplets everywhere. Maybe I just want them on parts of our model. But the thing is, given that this is a filter and it has to be added to a fill layer, we cannot directly add a black mask. But what we can do is to have this concept of adding a folder. So if we go ahead and add this folder, so a folder is not only a way of organizing your materials, but it's also another way of masking out your materials. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go ahead and make a copy of my material. So I'm just going to hit Control C, Control V, but you can also right click and hit copy and paste layers. So I'm going to go ahead and take my layer that's underneath and remove the water droplets. I just want the water droplets on this layer up here. And of course, I'm not sure if I've mentioned this, but if you toggle the eye icon next to layers, you can turn them on and off, very similar to Photoshop. So I have this folder. I'm going to go ahead and name it and call it maybe brass with water. I'm going to go ahead and click the first layer, shift click the second, and drag them into this folder. And that's how you move layers around. But in this case, for this folder, I only want the brass with water to be masked out. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is just pull out our brass pure layer and then just bring this underneath our folder. So now we only have our brass pure with matte FX water drop filter applied to it in our folder. So what we can do is add a black mask to our folder. So I'm going to right click and add black mask. And you can see now we can only see this brass pure material that we have underneath since the brass with water is currently blacked out. Then what we can do is go down to our polygon fill, but remember we could also paint in our black mask. In this case, I'll go ahead and apply a polygon fill. So I'm going to go ahead and select this triangle. And why don't I just click here? And look at that. I can go ahead and apply this filter to very specific areas. So say I just wanted the front of my chest to be dripping with water. I can go ahead and apply that filter right there by just selecting these triangles in my UV because these are being masked by our folder. Just like that. So as you can see, the way to use filters and generators are very flexible and very versatile. We can create some really cool effects just by adding these onto our layers. And I hope that you guys will go in and look at all of these options that we have for filters and generators. I only covered a few, but if we go ahead and add another filter and just look in here, there's so many cool effects that you can play with and add to your model and really get some cool textures going on. Alrighty, now that we've covered most of Substance Painter in its entirety, I would like to go ahead and walk you guys through how I ended up texturing this treasure chest using all of the methods that I taught today, using fill layers, paint layers, alphas, and all of that. And I'll also go ahead and show you a few other tricks that I use to really amp up some of the detail and the texturing on this thing. So let me go ahead here, and as you can see, I have a folder that I labeled chest textured, and I went ahead and put all of my layers into this folder so that when I zip it up like that, I can go ahead and toggle it on and off in case I want to see how things are looking and to just keep things clean and organized. So let's go ahead and start here from the bottom. I'm going to go ahead and toggle on my first layer, which I've labeled chest wood. So as you can see, if I open up this layer, I have a few folders in here. Usually you could probably achieve this with one folder, one fill layer, I should say, that you've kind of textured all of it to be this wood texture. However, I just went ahead and made a fill layer for different parts of the wood. So in case I wanted to change the detailing on one, make one a little dirtier, make one a little bit cleaner, just to have a little bit more control over what I'm texturing. So for this wood texture, all of these layers have similar properties. So let me go ahead and open one and show you what I did. So for this first fill layer in this folder, I went ahead and brought in this texture. As you can see, it's called basecolortextures.com_wood. So I went ahead and went to textures.com, downloaded a wood texture that I thought would be appropriate, and went ahead and imported it into my project as I showed you guys before, just dragging and dropping it in and selecting texture from the undefined box and going ahead and importing this. Once I did that, I went ahead and drag and dropped that into my base color as I showed you with how we could bring in textures for our base color for our fill and paint layers, and went ahead and applied that. And as you can see, I did that for all of these layers, and each layer has its own specific black mask. So I created a black mask for different parts of it. So for example, if I toggle this on and off, you can see that this layer has the top part of the chest as its mask. This layer has the back part of the chest. Actually, I think it's this part of the chest. There you go. And the other layers have their respective parts of the chest as well. As I said, I went ahead and separated different parts of the chest into different layers so that I could have a little bit more control on how much detail, how much grunge, and things that I am adding to the layers. But one thing that I do want to mention that is kind of fun in terms of adding grunge, I know in the previous video we covered generators and adding those to masks, but there's also another little trick that I like to use when doing this. So if I go ahead and toggle this fill layer right here, this fill layer is what is responsible for adding in some of the dirt that I have on the top of this. Let me go ahead and zoom in here for you. So some of this dirt that I have on here is actually caused by this fill layer right here. So as you can see, I have a fill layer with a color, a dirt color that I chose, and then I have a black mask so that I can control my dirt. But rather than adding a generator, I actually went in and added a smart mask. If we go down here to the left under smart masks, we have all of these masks, as I mentioned, also function similar to generators, in which we can go ahead and just drag and drop. So I have a different smart mask in here. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy and paste this layer and toggle off the one I have and go ahead and remove this mask. And I think this is a good time of how I can show you for me to show you how smart masks work. So if I want to go ahead and grab one that says dirt, let me go ahead and pick this up. All I need to do with the smart mask is I need to drag and drop it onto my black mask. And if you see that, it just added a layer on top of my chest. And similar to generators and filters, if I go down here and click on the mask itself, I can go and adjust some of its properties. So maybe I want more dirt, or maybe I want a little bit less dirt. Maybe I want to blur out the dirt a little bit more so it's not as harsh. I can also increase the contrast. So for all of these wood pieces, I went ahead and did the same process of starting with the base color, in which I imported a texture to my base color. And then I went ahead and added a fill layer with a black mask that I then proceeded to choose one of these smart masks to add to my black mask, and then played with my settings to see how much dirt, how I want the dirt, how I want the dirt to look, and the color of the dirt. I went ahead and just played with that to get different effects for different parts of the chest. Alrighty, moving right along, I'm going to go ahead and toggle my next layer, which is this metal material that will surround the outside of the chest. So if I go ahead and drop this down, as you can see, I've created another folder here so that I can effectively have all of my layers inside nice and organized. So for this metal, I went ahead and had this as my base color. So if I go ahead and scroll down here, you can see that I also brought in another texture from textures.com _ metal rough, imported that into my project, labeled it as a texture, and drag and dropped it into my base color. But if you see here, right under the fill layer, I have this thing called levels. So levels is something that you can add to any fill layer. Very similar to Photoshop, where you're going to add in a levels layer to maybe play with your gamma or play with your brightness. So if I go over here, I can show you how that's done. So if I go ahead and copy and paste my layer and toggle off what I had and remove this, if I right click on my fill layer, under where it says add generator and add filter, we have something called add level. So if I go ahead and toggle that, you can see in my properties, it brings up a little box where I can play with levels. So currently, the levels that I'm playing with are my base color. This is under affected channels. But I can also play with the levels of many other things. I can play with the levels of my metallic channel, my roughness channel, my normal map, and even my height. So for this case, I'm going to go ahead and just choose base color. And then I went ahead and just played with the levels to see what I liked. Did I want something a little bit brighter? Maybe I wanted to play with my gamma, bring out some highlights. So by doing that, I went ahead and got this effect. Is something that I liked. So maybe a little bit of a darker metal with areas that have some highlights popping and things like that. So if I go ahead and delete this layer right under it, I did something similar, but played with the levels of my normal map. So if you can see here, we have some scratches, some dents that are occurring right here. So in order to get this, I had another fill layer. If I go into my properties, you can see that I toggled off everything except my normal map. And if I go ahead and look over here, you can see that I brought in a normal map from textures.com. This normal map actually came with the base color. So if you go into textures.com and start downloading maps, they usually come with a variety of maps, such as our base color. They have normal maps. They have a height map, roughness map. So feel free to download and bring in any of those to really be able to have the effect that you were going for. So in this case, I brought in a normal map and went ahead and just plug that in to my normal channel, as you can see here. And then I went ahead and, as I did with the base color, added another levels node. But in this case, under affected channel, I changed base color into normal. And then you can go ahead and play here to kind of adjust the look of the normal map and how it interacts with the light. So if I Control Z here, I can go back to the effect that I had before, which was this is the type of a normal map that I wanted. Something that can show the dents and scratches, but is actually a little bit more subtle than the other levels that I was just playing with. Additionally, there's another trick that we can add in order to get some detail. So if you see up here, I have another fill layer here and a black mask. But if you go under the black mask, you can see that I have this grunge attached to it. So adding grunges are in your shelf right here. So if we open our grunge right here on the left, you can see that we have all of these grunges that I mentioned that you could paint with, but you could also use these grunges to add detail. And let me show you how I did that. So if I go ahead and Command C, this layer right here, let me go ahead and check which grunge I used. All right. So over here, if I go ahead and remove this, I had a black mask that I added to a fill layer with kind of this kind of lightish, kind of, mud brown color. And if I go over to the black mask and right click, as if I was going to add a generator, a levels, or a filter, I can go ahead and add a fill layer. So what this does is essentially says that I'm going to fill the fill layer that I already have with information from the black mask. So once we've added a fill layer to this black mask, we can see here that we have an option for grayscale. And grayscale is where we can plug in our grunge values because our grunge maps are actually grayscale channels. So if I go over here, I can go ahead and search for rust, which is what I went ahead and used for my dirt, to get kind of the more dirty effect. I'm going to go over here and drop that into my grayscale. And if you can see, if I go ahead and exit out of it, it went ahead and added this grunge with the color that I had selected in my original fill layer. So the original fill layer is what's going to control our color and all of these channels. But when we go into our mask and go into the properties of the grunge we added, is where we can start to make adjustments similar to our generators, such as playing with the balance of this grunge, or maybe we want higher contrast in the grunge, or maybe we would want to scale the size of the grunge and things like that. So adding a fill to a black mask to proceed to add grunge is another way of getting different effects than what a normal dirt generator could do. So after adding that, I put all of this into one folder, as you can see up here, and we have our metal material for our treasure chest. Moving right along, I went ahead and have this gold material for the front of the chest and the sides. And this gold material is actually a smart material. If I want to navigate down here to our smart materials, there's a material here called gold damage. I went ahead, just drag and dropped it in, just like that. And this is the material that I went ahead and used for the front and the sides. So if I go ahead and delete that, as you can see here, this material already comes in a folder, which is something really nice about smart materials. As you can see, if I drop this folder down, this gold damage material has a lot of layers to it. But what is nice is that you can also go through a lot of these layers and toggle what you like and what you don't like and go into every single layer and play with the values. As you can see, I did not make any of these layers myself. I kind of used the smart material and went into each of these layers and played with the values to get what I wanted. For example, if I wanted less or more dirt, I could navigate down to this layer that they have conveniently named for us as dirt. If I open the mask, I can see that they have added an ambient occlusion generator to this, and I can go ahead and play with these values if I want to change them. Additionally, if I go to something like our surface grain, for example, if I go ahead and navigate there, I can see that they have added a fill layer with some grain properties in here as grayscale, as I've shown you guys, for some directional scratches. And then I can go ahead and play with this slider. Maybe I want to play with some contrast values and really modify and customize these values to be what I want them to be. If I go all the way down, we can see that this is our base color with those properties. I can go ahead and play with the metallic value, as you can see here, play with my roughness. So what's really nice is that with materials and smart materials, you are given the complete freedom to edit all of the layers as you wish. And you can, in fact, even add your own layers. So for example, if I really liked this dirt layer, this grunge layer that I made for my treasure chest, I can just make a copy of it, Control C, Control V, and drag it into the hierarchy of this gold damage material. And as you can see, I have this dirt now applied to this gold as well. And of course, I can go ahead and play with some of the values. So maybe I want not too much grunge. I can also go back to the color of the original fill layer and I can change that. So maybe I don't want something super brown. Maybe I want just a little bit of a dusty effect. And of course, as I mentioned, you can also play with these settings next to your fill layer right here, which are your opacity and your blending modes as they are in Photoshop. And I can go ahead and maybe even toggle through these to see if I get an effect that I like. And sometimes you know exactly what you are doing and what effect you're looking for when you're making your materials. Sometimes you end up with things that are just happy accidents, as I could say, and it turns out creating something really cool that you never expected it to. And sometimes a good way to get that is just to experiment and see what you're liking and what you're getting. And another quick tip here is if, say, you make some happy accidents or you really make a material that you love and you think is super cool. So for example, say that I really like how this metal is looking. And this metal could be something I want to use later on down the line. What I can do is create my own smart material. So what I'm going to do here is something that you need to keep in mind for smart materials is that they need to be in a folder themselves. So you have this folder that I've named Treasure Chest Metal. And something you want to also ensure is that you have all of your masks removed. So masks are, of course, on a case-by-case basis, depending on which UVs you're painting and what parts of a certain model that you want painted. However, the purpose of a smart material is to make sure that this material can be used universally. So I want to be able to create this metal material, use it on another object, and then I can take care of my masking process there. So when creating a smart material, something that I always like to remember is that all of my layers are nicely organized in a folder. And then what I want to do is I can just make a copy of this and go ahead and start removing all of these masks. So I'm going to remove the mask here. I'm going to go ahead and leave these masks. So I should actually clarify. You want to remove masks that have specific UVs in them. That is very important to make sure that the masks that you're removing have specific UVs. If it is a mask like this, where you've added a grunge, you can keep that. But if your mask contains specific UV information, you want to make sure that you're removing that so that you can actually use this material as something more universal for a material down the line. So I went ahead and just went ahead and hid all of the layers that I have. So currently I just have this metal material. And to make a smart material, all you're going to do is right click on treasure chest material and click create smart material. And if you give it a second, if I navigate to my smart materials, I can go down here and see that it created my material. So I can go ahead and use this treasure chest material as a smart material of my own. For example, just dragging and dropping that into my project. And you can see that I have this metal material to use as I like. Just like that. So I'm going to go ahead and delete these. And let's go ahead and go right back to where we were. So we had just finished adding in our gold material, adding in our metal, and we have our wood. Now, my final touch that I had added in here, just to give a little bit of detail, if I go ahead and toggle this layer, are these little metal ovals, just to add some detailing. And as you can see, this layer that I've titled metal rounds is a paint layer, because these little metal rounds are actually alphas. And if everyone recalls, we can only add alphas into paint layers. And the way I did this is I went ahead and used my projection mode, which is this right here, in order to make sure that I'm getting a straight on perpendicular projection of these alphas. And then if I open my metal rounds here, I'm going to go into my alphas. So the alpha I used for this one was actually, I went ahead and typed in circle, and then I used this one called shape circle. And of course, if you double click, it will go ahead and change your alpha into shape circle. I wanted to give it some sort of metal look. So one other thing that you could do with your base color is right above it, there's something called material mode. So if I go ahead and click that, you can see that it brings up all of my materials that are similar to the materials over here on the left in our shelf. So for this material, I believe I used aluminum as my material. And then now that I have this material selected, I can actually go in and alter its properties. So I did go ahead and bump up my roughness just a little bit, and I left my metallic the same. So now, as you can see over here in the viewport, let me go ahead and make this a little smaller so it makes it a little easier to see, is I have my alpha ready. So as we recall, if we hold down Control and left click and drag, I can rotate my brush to see how I want my alpha to look. And additionally, in order to get kind of this thickness, you want to make sure that your height is turned on. And I went ahead and bumped my height all the way to 1 so I can get that extruded effect. And I just went ahead and did a stamp just like that, and a stamp just like this. So if I go ahead and Control Z, you can see that I went ahead and did the same stamping method on the front, all the way on the top, going to the back of this treasure chest. And just by doing that, I went ahead and added a little bit more extra detail to my chest. And with that, we are just about done. And now comes the really fun part where we can start rendering this object and getting it to look as cinematic and game ready as possible. Now that we have completed texturing our object, let's talk rendering. So if we go over here to the top right and click on rendering, it's going to take us into our render view, which Painter starts rendering things in iRay. And we can see here that we have a lot of settings we can play with and really amp up our presentation. So if we look at the top here, it tells us it is currently rendering and our rendering time and iterations. We can easily change that. So if we go over here to max samples, we can bump this up to as much as we want in order to get the best result. We can also change the time on this so that we can get more time for it to render in order to get rid of a lot of noise and get the best quality as possible. We can also override a viewport resolution. So if I go ahead and click that, it allows me to type in the resolution that I want. So if I can go in and I like 1920, so I'm going to go ahead and type in 1080, as this is what I usually like to render in. And there we go. It'll go ahead and override the resolution that it has to what you would like it to do. And we can also, when it's done rendering, hit this icon called Save Render, and it'll save your render as the file type of your choice. So if we scroll down here, we can see that we have a lot of settings to play with in terms of our lighting and our environment. So under Environment Map, if I click this, I have a lot of options as to what I want my environment to be. Right now, I have it set to, I believe, panorama, but I can easily change that to something like maybe Autumn Forest, Boniface, Aragon Stairs. So I kind of think this is kind of cool, kind of having this treasure chest on the shore. So whatever image that you like and you think provides you the best lighting, feel free to go ahead and change your environment to that. Also, we have some settings down here where we can adjust the exposure of the environment. And we can also adjust the rotation of the environment. But remember, we can also use Shift right click as a hotkey to play with this environment rotation. Additionally, if we scroll down, we have dome type. And we can change our dome type to something like infinite sphere, so we don't have a ground anymore. We can go ahead and change it to sphere or sphere with ground, which will give us this ground to give us some nice shadows and something for our object to sit on. But if we don't want this environment at all, we can go ahead and hit clear color. And what clear color does is it just changes our background to the color of our choice. And if we go ahead and click this little box right here, we can play with that color. So maybe I want something red. Maybe I want it to just be on a plain black background. So we can really go ahead and adjust the color and the tone to really find a background that suits us and something that we want to render on. Additionally, something that is really nice is that we can play with our camera itself. So if you see here, we can adjust our field of view. So how much of the image do we want to be in our camera, which as you can see also directly changes the focal length. But what's also really cool is that we can play with depth of field and play with aperture. So if I bump up my aperture a little bit here, you can see that my image starts to get a little blurry. And that means that it wants me to go ahead and hone in on one area so we can get that really cool depth of field effect. So if I drop my aperture just a tad bit and kind of play with my focus distance here, we can start to get it to focus on one part of the object. So a lot of this, as you can see, is just a little bit of trial and error. So if I'm dropping my focus distance a little bit, I can see that it's getting a tad bit blurry. But if I up it a little bit, we can see that this handle is starting to come more into focus. And then I would go back and play with my aperture just a little bit more to kind of get this side handle to come into focus and kind of blur out the rest of my treasure chest. So playing with these settings can be really fun in trying to get a very interesting and very unique render for your object. Something that's also super cool when rendering in Substance Painter is that we have this option to activate post effects. So if we go over here, right above where we're playing with the camera, we want to go ahead and select Activate Post Effects. I think what I'm also going to do is go ahead and drop my clear color just a little bit here. Just get some contrast going. Okay, that's kind of like that, how that's looking a little bit better. Let's go down here. And we have color correction, tone mapping, my favorite, the vignette, and lens distortion, lots of cool things we can do here. If we go into tone mapping, something you want to make sure, which is something I personally goofed on a little bit, is you want to make sure even though you've enabled post effects right here, you want to go ahead and enable post effects here as well, or it is not going to show up. So here I'm kind of playing with the exposure. I have some control over my gamma. Some of my values over here. I can change my settings over here. A lot of these are something that you just need to play with a little bit, see what you feel. That's a little too flat for my liking. I think I like something like this could be really poppy and fun. I like the color that's coming off of I like the colors that are they're a little bit more bright and a little bit more poppy. But if I think that the wood might be a little much, of course, enable this. And I might drop my color correction just a tad to make the wood just a tad less saturated. I think I'm liking that a little bit. Really liking that color. Of course, sometimes you just have to play a little bit to really find that middle ground where you're getting some good value coming off of your render, but you're not overdoing anything. You could have hours of fun just playing with some of these values. No, make sure you enable. See something cool like this. Maybe I want like a little twinkle coming off of that gold handle right there. I can go ahead and enable that on my glare. I have a value as how much twinkle that I want coming off of it. Get that little shine coming off of the side. We also have this factor right here that kind of controls the intensity of it. We can play with our luminance to see how intense or not we want it. Really liking how that's looking. The vignette is my favorite because I think it just adds just a lot of drama to the scene. So if I go in here and I start to drop, if I actually go ahead and increase my clear color just a tad, so I want something a little bit lighter than what I had, and I can go in here and increase the strength. I can start to get this kind of frame coming around my treasure chest right there. And it's really giving this nice cinematic effect and just a lot of drama and just something a little bit more poppy than what I had. So there's a lot of fun stuff you can play with in here. If we go down here, there are some settings as well. Activating temporal anti-aliasing is usually very good if you want like very high quality edges going on. You don't want them to be blurred out. You want them nice and crisp. It's a good idea to have this on. Subsurface scattering, if you're working with anything like skin, leaves, for example, where light needs to pass through, but it's not quite transparent, but you want to be able to see that color. You want to activate subsurface scattering. We also have more viewport setting down here in terms of your camera. I don't play with these too much. Usually once I have my camera set up, I like to set up the angle, make sure that my lighting is looking good from my environment, and then go ahead and play with some post. If we go over here to shader settings, as I mentioned, you can find your shader settings not in your render view as well. If we had an emissive material, we could go ahead and play with that intensity. If we had something like glass or something transparent, we can play with refraction as well as the index of refraction. Similar to here, where we have our subsurface scattering, you want to make sure that you enable, scroll down here, want to make sure you enable subsurface scattering. And then if you go back to your shader settings, you can go ahead and play with the amount of scattering and the absorption. And there are more parameters here for your scattering as well. Displacement and tessellation, if you want just a bit more of a push, a bit more extrusion or intrusion in your height, we can go ahead and adjust the displacement scale. But I'm really liking how this is looking. I really like the glare, like that little glow that's coming off of the gold. I'm liking the color of the wood. I'm liking how my metal is looking. Maybe I want to twist the light just a tad to see if I can get a few more highlights coming off. Maybe a bit more shadow depth here. Let me go ahead and move this maybe to the right. Yeah, I think I want to move it just a tad more so I can get a little bit of shine coming off the front there. I think that's kind of cool. Or I think maybe I just like it coming off of the handle so we don't overkill on the amount of glare that we have going on. But yes, I think I'm liking this. A lot of the render settings are just I mean, a lot of the post effect settings are just a lot of play. You'll be surprised to find out what you can come up with, just by moving the slider around, playing with some of these drop down menus, for example, some of these blending modes. For example, under tone mapping, I changed our function to auto, but you can get very different results if you go in and change it to some of these blend modes. But other than that, I think I'm liking how this is rendering. If we want a quick idea of how it was looking in our viewport here, now we can see that our viewport has changed since we fixed our display settings. But if we really want our good render, we're going to go ahead and pop it into iRay. I'll probably set my samples here to maybe 5,000 or so, something like that. And I'll probably set the minutes to maybe like 10, and then just let it render. And that will take away my noise, and just give me the cleanest render as possible, and I'm ready to save it as a PNG or JPEG. But yes, I am very pleased with how this is looking. I hope everyone liked it as well. I'm going to go ahead and render this and drop a final image at the end of this video, so y'all can see how it ends up looking after it's done rendering. I want to say thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope that everyone had a lot of fun, and I hope you learned a lot. Thank you so much again. I hope everyone is staying safe and staying healthy, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your summer. And I hope to catch you guys on another one. Thank you so much. Bye.